don't know if you all can see the attendees trickling in, but they're coming through in 27, 29. We'll wait. We had over 120 signups, so we'll wait until we get what feels like critical mass. But in the meantime, those of you who are coming in, welcome to this joint presentation by the Jaxson magazine and the Jessie DuPont Fund of what we hope is going to be the first in a series of conversations about the diverse history that lies underneath the surface of Jacksonville. And we're edging up to about 50 attendees. In the meantime, I'll just mention that we have 4 panelists today. I will go ahead and introduce them after we have all the attendees. But the format of today's session is intended to be for each panelist to give us, up to 10 minutes of their perspective on both the Rosenwald documentary, the links between the Jewish community and the African American community, specifically in Jacksonville, and how that plays out in our lived environment. We will be starting with Aviva, the woman behind the documentary that we hope you all watched. So looks like we have 54 attendees, and maybe that is what we have to start. I don't want to take time away from any of the panelists' sessions. So I am going to declare that this is critical mass and start talking. Oh, I love it. There was a comment in the chat saying it was a great documentary. So this might be the time when I introduce Aviva, the woman behind this documentary. Aviva has a mission in life. Her films investigate non-stereotypical images of Jews in history and celebrate the untold stories of Jewish heroes. So she has made many notable documentaries, but I think you all want to hear so much about all the love and thought that went into Julius Rosenwald's story. So I'm going to let Aviva get started. Aviva, I think you may be still muted.
Thanks so much, especially to all the hard work that you and Katie did to arrange today. I really appreciate it. People always ask me, how did you come about making this film? So I always explain that first. It turns out, as was described, I make films about underknown Jewish heroes fighting isms. And with my first film, Partisans of Vilna, it was fighting the Nazis, Nazism. With Hank Greenberg, it was fighting anti-Semitism. With Molly Goldberg, it was sexism and McCarthyism. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. And I went to a lecture on Martha's Vineyard at the Hebrew Center, where Rabbi David Saperstein was speaking, and also one of my heroes who I hadn't met up until then, and that was the late civil rights leader, Julian Bond. And the lecture was billed as Blacks and Jews. So I decided, oh my God, I've got to go. And I thought quite logically that I was going to hear about the civil rights era. But then Julian started talking about what it meant to have a philanthropist from the North like Julius Rosenwald and all the work he had done both in the schools and in the Rosenwald Fund, because it turns out that Julian himself, if you know from the film, both his father and his uncle had been recipients. So from there, I started this wonderful journey in making the film. And the film came out in 2015. But what was great is there was so much rich material that I got more grants, and I did both 4.5 hours more of bonus features of many more stories that were in the film, elaborated, as well as stories that even didn't make it to the film, some of which I'll touch on today. And I also have a study guide, which you can go to the website and download. And now we're working on the Kellogg Foundation. I have to thank them for offering these screenings all around the country. And we're just finishing them off of end of next month. And then we're hoping, once we pay off the rights, to do a streaming deal with the film. So what was amazing for me is several things I'm going to just touch about today. Is here you have someone like Julius Rosenwald up in the north, who at 16, as you can see from the film, had stopped going to school. He essentially went to go learn business, but wound up to be the great supporter of education. And second of all, you have him reading a biography, autobiography, Up from Slavery. And it only shows you how a book can change someone's life. It was both reading Booker T's autobiography and then coming down and visiting Tuskegee, but it was also listening to his rabbi. There's a principle in Judaism called Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, and tzedakah, charity. And that's something Rabbi Hirsch really preached, and Julius Rosenwald really listened to it. As a matter of fact, he brought the rabbi, who was one of the original signers, by the way, of the NAACP call for action, and they came down and visited. And it was, as you see in the film, on his 50th birthday, he was asking people he already had given money to, including Tuskegee University, what can I do? And that's when Booker T said, well, we're doing really well with the college, but it's getting the kids before they go to college. He understood very young, we've got to improve the schools. Now, there's one thing that happened in an exchange between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T that I think is really significant. Understandably, Julius Rosenwald said, well, if you're going to build these schools, we have these kid houses. Just use the ones we have. And Booker T said, no, we want to build them in the community. And I think this is one of the great examples of community initiative and being part of it. And then, of course, the whole development of green architecture. The way the windows stood, what they faced, et cetera. I just think it's marvelous, as well as the fact that here's oftentimes you'll have one school house, one big room, and the younger kids would hear what the older kids was doing, which I understand is really the Montessori system. But what really also hit me is, because, I've been making films for 40 years, and in the beginning it was a struggle, and I'm always looking for funding. I think the Rosenwald Fund is one of the greatest examples of how you can help artisans. And what was key about the Rosenwald Fund, and a lot of it has to do with Embry, and you should look them up, is the fact that it gave to young African-American artists. Most of which who turned out to be, they really saw talent when it was there. I mean, if you go to the Phillips Museum, which I'm lucky enough to be a member of, and I'm here in town, or in a MoMA, you'll see the split collection of Migration by Jacob Lawrence. The one story that hits me more than anything is Augusta Savage. If you see behind me, there's a portrait. My mother was an abstract expressionist painter. So being the daughter of an artist and thinking, if my mother ever had the choice, Helen, you can't move your works, you can't afford to, and to see that her wonderful sculpture, I have a miniature of it, the harp, lift up every voice and sing, that she had no choice but to send it to, the junkyard. That haunts me till today. So I've written an essay that was published in the New York Times, and we always talk about statues being destroyed now and really questioning, a lot of them being worthy of public spaces. And by the way, I'm very proud. I hope you saw the film all the way to the end, that it was dedicated to Black Lives Matter and the fact that we don't have voting rights and statehood in Washington. But in any event, I'm calling for a movement, and Darren Walker of the Ford Foundation has funded a grant to the National Trust to study it, that Augusta Savage's statues be restored. And I say it in the plural because my dream would be there'd be one in the area where, where we're sponsoring today's event, And the other speaker will talk to why there. I would love to see it back in New York or Queens, where it was originally seen. I live in Washington. I think it would be great to have a replica also in front of the Museum of the National African American Museum. And then I have this fun idea that, since the fund came out of Chicago, it would be great also to have a replica by Obama's presidential library. He doesn't know it yet. And let me just give you a couple more factoids, and I'll leave it to the rest of the others. But you see Barbara Bowman in the film talking about the Michigan Garden apartment and how rich, people visited there and lived there. Quincy Jones, Marian Anderson, Olympic runners. Well, it turns out she's a great educator, and she just happens to be the mother of Valerie Jarrett, who worked in the Obama administration, and you see her on the news all now, which I think has to do so much about the legacy. Julian Bond talks about that in the film. And then some of the footage that was taken of the kids, I actually have a law degree, and thanks to the DC bar for flunking me, I don't do well multiple choice questions. I became a filmmaker, but there was a civil rights lawyer here, Charles Hamilton Houston, who was at head of Harvard Law School and worked on a lot of civil rights cases. And he actually took some of that footage. So you never know when the footage is going to come later. He was a protege of Thurgood Marshall. So anyhow, I'm going to send this off to others, but thank you so much for being here today. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Which is a great segue for me to let everyone know that there is a Q&A icon on your Zoom screens. And if you have questions that occur to you for any of the speakers, please feel free to post your questions there. And as soon as we get around to them, we will answer them. And if we don't get around to them in the conversation today, because the conversation is so engaging between the panelists, we'll make sure to get you the answers via email as we have your information when you registered. Next up is Stephen Whitfield. Now, Stephen is a Jacksonville native, went in fact to DuPont Elementary, then DuPont Junior and Senior High, and later taught American history in Jacksonville at Wolfson High School. He is a retired professor of history from Brandeis American Studies. And I am going to post in the chat a chapter that he wrote about the Jewish history of La Villa. And Stephen, I am going to ask you to kind of contextualize Rosenwald as it might fit in, and Jewish philanthropy as it might fit into Jacksonville's history. And you're muted, so you will have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Amari, thank you very much. It's really an honor to participate in this panel. And thank you also for clarifying that I'm not only a graduate of DuPont, which makes me probably the person on the panel with the closest connection to the Jessie Ball DuPont Foundation, but you made it clear that I'd also attended DuPont Elementary, DuPont Junior High, DuPont Senior High. I didn't flunk out of classes so that I had to keep repeating grades for 12 years. But it was because of how DuPont actually kept changing its status. What I'd like to do is pick up a little bit along the line of what you suggested, Mari, having to do with the connection between Julius Rosenwald and James Weldon Johnson, who was undoubtedly the most important artistic figure ever to come out of the history of Jacksonville itself. He was the principal of the largest Black school in the state of Florida, Stanton, a figure of extraordinary virtuosity, executive secretary of the NAACP, and of course, the lyricist of Lift Every Voice and Sing. But the point here that is, it seems to me so striking, he's a pivotal figure in what Aviva's film also presents, which is the transition really from culture to politics. or from the artistry of the African-American community into the civil rights movement and into political engagement. And that is what James Weldon Johnson in the 1920s was able to convey to the Rosenwald Foundation, to Edwin Embry in particular, was the notion that in confronting the extraordinary pressures of white racism in the early 20th century, and the extraordinary challenge that was posed into how you get the overwhelming majority of whites in America in that era to recognize the full humanity, the full plenitude of Black Americans. One way of doing that would be to demonstrate the extraordinary artistic vitality, the creativity, the performative ability of African Americans. So it's James Weldon Johnson, who was a political figure as well as an artist. It was he who really made the connection that if somehow you could fully support and allow Black creativity to flourish in America, that would be an extraordinary act of momentum against the white racism that was so pervasive in the United States. So it's not only Rosenwald's generosity that's at stake here, it's not only his remarkable philanthropy, but he was able to give it a certain purpose through Johnson's capacity to convey the way by which, by supporting Black artists of various sorts, and of course that includes writers and scientists and physicians, as Aviva's film demonstrates. It's a way of indicating the way by which Black achievement could be recognized, and in some ways the degree of white prejudice could somehow be reduced. In James Weldon Johnson's autobiography, Along This Way, published in 1933, he considers the curiosity of what would happen if Jeannie were to ask him if he could be a member of any other race other than being a Black American. Johnson was a race man. Johnson exuded Black pride, but he says in the autobiography that if he could be anything other than Black, he said he would be a Jew. It's a mysterious statement. He doesn't explain it. He doesn't offer any account of how he reaches that conclusion. But this is, it seems to me, if I may be permitted to do so, this allows us to talk a little bit about Jacksonville, because the Jews who came to Jacksonville, to the area of La Villa, lived in basically what was a mixed neighborhood, Blacks and Jews, as well as other groups. The Jews who came from Eastern Europe, heavily from Lithuania, into Jacksonville in the early 20th century, were extraordinarily poor. There was a saying among them that we weren't poor, but we only ate chicken if we were sick or if the chicken was. And that is a way of indicating now that they all started from the same way, which was virtually at the bottom in terms of poverty and misery. And even though there is no paper trail that leads from James Weldon Johnson in Jacksonville to the Jews who lived in Jacksonville with other African Americans, it's at least possible, I think, for an historian to say, although there's no documentary evidence, at least James Weldon Johnson's experience in Jacksonville did not in any way deter him from having a positive attitude toward Jews. That's about as far as we can go, but we can say that the Jews who lived in the La Villa area, of course, started in often in struggling along the lines of the least glamorous, the most demanding sorts of occupations. It was a commonplace, for example, to be in the junk business, or whatever you want to call it, the salvage business. Now we would dignify it by calling it the recycling business. The most important family in American economic history that came out of La Villa was the family in which the patriarch was an immigrant from Lithuania named Morris Wolfson. And his sons in particular entered economic life already as kids through the junk business and started in that way, and in some cases making an extraordinary fortune. It's not possible in the time allotted to really describe what they did, except to note that the sons, and I'm thinking particularly of the one who became the most famous and in fact the richest, Louis Wolfson, remembers that he was 10 years old and living in that area. The shock of seeing firemen who were Klansmen in that neighborhood, having tarred and feathered a 10-year-old Black teenager, put a rope around his neck and dragged him through the street. The Wolfson kids never forgot that incident. They had previously been friendly with the firemen. After that, they would have nothing further to do with the firemen. The sons grew up into being racial liberals at the time. Sam Wolfson was to become the owner of the Jacksonville Braves, the Class A Sally League, South Atlantic League team, whose most famous member in the mid-1950s was Hank Aaron. The Jacksonville Braves won the pennant with Hank Aaron. And in an extraordinary public ceremony, Sam Wolfson said of Hank Aaron, "He is like a son to me," a somewhat surprising statement of that era that indicates the racial liberalism of the Wolfson family. And I can finish the story only briefly. It's a long, complicated story of the Jews who grew up in La Villa, except that Lou Wolfson became a financier and what would later be called a corporate raider. And the chief company that he tried to take over and made him his most publicized episode as a financier was to take over the try to take over the mail order business of the chief rival of Sears Roebuck, and that was Montgomery Ward. So I'll stop my part of the story by closing that particular loop to indicate really something of the relations between Blacks and Jews in Jacksonville.
Those are wonderful stories, Stephen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to follow up next with some remarks from Adonnica Toler, who, as those of you who are attending from Jacksonville know, as the head of the Ritz Theater and Museum. If you have not visited the Ritz Theater and Museum, you must visit it. As I understand it, Adonnica, the museum is open. So please, please find time to head out there. And of course, the Ritz Theater is in the heart of La Villa, where in fact, that was of course the main African-American community. And I am going to let her talk a little bit about the Ritz Theater's heritage, but its links to Augusta Savage, and of course, also its links to Jewish philanthropy. So Adonnica, please go ahead. And you are muted, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
There we go. So hello, everyone. This is thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. Very excited and very honored with the other panelists. I respect all of them, and I learned from all of them. So the Ritz Theater Museum originally was built, well, the Ritz Theater, I should say, was originally built in 1929, and it was owned by the Whitfield family, which was a Jewish family. And it was one of 4 theaters, in this neighborhood that African Americans could attend for entertainment due to segregation, as you would understand. Only 2 theaters in this neighborhood still exist. One is us, the Ritz, and the other serves now has another mission, and it's the Claire White mission, was the Globe Theater. And so they're the only 2 standing, actually they're the only 2 standing of all the segregated Black theaters that were for the Black community standing. It's really, and that the whole La Villa neighborhood is a very interesting neighborhood. I think most people really do not understand that it was a multicultural neighborhood or city. I would say city because it originally was a city. It says it was an African American neighborhood, but it was very diverse. James Weldon Johnson even makes that statement in his autobiography along this way, that the neighborhood, the very street that he lived on, there were people from different countries on the same street as his family. Dutchman, German, Cuban, Spanish. And the Johnson family themselves were actually Bahamian, which most people do not realize. So the La Villa neighborhood was ahead, and to me ahead of its time, because of how racially diverse the city was. There were racial tensions, but nothing such that we would see coming in the future. It was there, but it wasn't anything that was really restraining, because James does talk about being able to move around a little freely. Even when they went to public venues to see a show, even though blacks and whites were separated, they weren't separated as stringently as we would see later on. So I'm not sure. I'm still very intrigued by what was the spirit. Why did La Villa had that spirit about it, that it was so diverse. But it also is the reason why I think that it was so fruitful. We had so many talented people coming out of it. We talking about the Wilson brothers and the Lingo family and all these other families were amidst that. African Americans were in leadership positions. They were on the city council. They were police chiefs, fire chiefs. So their political power for the African American in La Villa was very strong. They were very active. You had individuals like Eartha White who would later come in this area and establish the Claire White Mission. You had the Johnson brothers themselves. Their parents, I think this is the other thing, their parents were phenomenal. There's a Shiloh Metropolitan Baptist Church that is a few blocks from us, like really like right across the street from me almost. Came about from the work of their father, the philanthropy, the humanitarian work of their father, looking after the prostitutes and the drunkards, because they did live close to the red light district. And their father really had a ministry that looked after those individuals who were forgotten and downtrodden. And so all of that was the righteous and the unredeemable were all together. And I think that made it what it was, the richness that came out of it, the diversity that came out of it. We've had individuals tell us there were orange groves, that even in this generation, that they remember orange groves being here. They remember huge sand dunes coming to the Ritz. They remember to the movie, there are these sand dunes in this area. So this whole, what we know about La Villa is a Pandora box of things we do not know. And then to produce so many talented people from James Weldon Johnson, and James Weldon Johnson is very talented, but we cannot forget John Rosamond. John Rosamond really helped shape what was going on in New York Broadway stage. He was helping to shape that. He helped shape blues and jazz music. W.C. Handy, in his autobiography, talked about how he and John would just sit together and make up songs together and just rearrange old Negro intros and make new jazz and blues songs. So I think people, and I appreciate them saying, oh, this is an African American community. But even as I work here and we celebrate African American community, I've always said, I've got to figure out a way to let people know there were other ethnic groups in this community that worked with the African American community. There was Chinese Association. I remember my early research on doing Eartha White. She was my subject in college. And I saw there was a Chinese Association not too far from the mission. I was like, there were Chinese in La Villa? So it's just amazing of what a fertile ground this area was. And now it is, If you come in here, you can't see it. You have no idea. You know, we here, you know, the Ritz is here, but you don't really know what the landscape was and how rich everything is. It has been urban removal, gentrification is in play. And so there are many of us who are having efforts to make sure you know the rich heritage that is here. So it is, it's just it's a big endeavor to make people to really understand how rich this heritage is. And so one of the things that when you come to the museum, you will see a animatronic exhibit of James Weldon Johnson and John Rosamond and how the song Lift Every Voice and Sing came about. And I always want to make people understand that without John Rosamond Johnson, I do not think we would know the poem Lift Every Voice and Sing as we know the song. John put it to music and we sing it. It is now 120, getting ready to be 121 years old. And it is a very important part of the African American community. Other cultures are now celebrating it, but I know that anytime that I went growing up as a child, any church service or any event, Black event, the first thing they did was sing Lift Every Voice and Sing, and then they did prayer. So it has become a very important part of our community, and for them to connect with Augusta Savage and influence her, that she would create something to celebrate that song. It's amazing. And then she named it Lift Every Voice and Sing. So I know we call it the Harp. So I always let people know the artist named it Lift Every Voice and Sing. So I try to honor that. And so Augusta Savage coming to Jacksonville, growing up in Green Cove Springs, Florida, not having the support of her father about creating her images, being punished and all those things. Yet she endured and she went on to be a very important part of the Harlem Renaissance. Even though she did not get the accolades that she should have gotten, she mentored others who went on to be great. And so I think that's one of the important parts of her legacy. That's why I put myself on timer so I know when I need to be quiet. So, this, just know that this area is so rich in history. There's so many ethnic groups that have come out of this area and they're all connected. You will find that they are connected. And it's very interesting that they would connect, that James and John and Augusta and Zora Neale Hurston would connect in New York, especially during the Harlem Renaissance. I think that's
Thank you,
my time, isn't
Adonnica.
it?
Yes, thank you, Adonnica. And I've taken the liberty of sharing an artist rendering of what it might look
Yes.
like outside the Ritz.
Yes, that would be
The
fabulous.
Augusta Savage statue were to be recreated, which we hope might happen.
Correct.
I am now going to shift gears. And by the way, I don't know how many people are logging on to this conference from Jacksonville, but for those of you who don't know Jacksonville, this is what the neighborhood kind of looks like.
Looks like now. Mm-hmm.
It is a whole lot of empty spaces. So, and I'm going to stop sharing, and shift gears back to Ennis, who is a urban planner extraordinaire, but even more so, sort of the repository of knowledge of all things Jacksonville. I have come to discover that he knows everything about Jacksonville that I would ever discover in a book or not in a book.
Right.
And so I'm going to ask him to sort of bring this all together into the built environment, or perhaps what's gone from the built environment in Jacksonville.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction. I'll try to do you guys some honor with that. So if you look at my screenshot, that is La Villa. That's Bay Street in La Villa around 1920. And what's interesting about Bay Street is that was a Greek district known as Railroad Row. So as we mentioned, this was a cultural melting pot. The villa was established as its own independent city, separate from Jacksonville in 1866, right after the Civil War. And it really was the gateway to Florida. So you wonder about why it was so diverse. I mean, this is where the majority of the railroads that came into Florida entered. And from that point, as the Florida continued to grow, if you want to go to Tampa or Miami, in the villa is kind of where you would switch trains. So from that aspect, it became this cultural melting pot. There was a early Cuban cigar industry that was based here that was just as prominent as what was in Key West and Tampa. If you read James Weldon Johnson's Along This Way's autobiography, it talks a lot about that Cuban cigar history. And they even had a young friend at the age of 14, I believe, Ricardo Rodriguez Ponce, who actually lived with them and taught them Spanish. So their household in and of itself was a multicultural household. There's a Chinese district that was on Adams Street. There was a Jewish district that was in the vicinity of Jefferson and Monroe Street. And so it really was a diverse place. So what happened to it? Everybody wants to know what happened to it. I would say there are a lot of things that took place gradually over time. I would just point out a quick 6 things. One of those things is urban renewal. La Villa was a neighborhood that was always systemically discriminated against in terms of public zoning policy, public investment, area that was always deemed to be blighted, or where urban renewal funds during the early 20th century would be used, or where industrial uses, for example, would be zoned adjacent to residential areas as a way to protect historically white areas of town from having those type of land uses in their neighborhoods. So urban renewal is a big factor in that. 95 was constructed in 1960. State and Union was converted from what were more mixed-use residential streets into an at-grade expressway at this point. And even just to the west of I-95, the U.S. Post Office, I mean, that took out a large chunk of the neighborhood as the post office transitioned from a rail-based operation to a more truck-based operation in the 1970s. Another challenge would have been desegregation. La Villa had an economy that was built off of segregation. People of all means, colors, and creeds had to live in neighborhoods like this. They weren't allowed to stay in certain areas. And so as desegregation came into play, not just in La Villa, this is present in several neighborhoods in Jacksonville and in Florida and across the US. The economic foundation of a lot of the business strips and the economies of these neighborhoods were taken away through desegregation. Then there's a decline in rail traffic. La Villa, its major economic anchor was at Jacksonville Terminal. And in addition to that terminal, there were several other railroad terminals. There was Atlantic and East Coast Freight Depot that was just north of the train station. You had that postal complex that handled 80% of the mail coming into Florida during its heyday. And then there's a Railway Express agency terminal that was on Myrtle Avenue, which is where JTA's maintenance facilities are at today. And that terminal was one of the largest terminals they had at their time. And the Railway Express agency is pretty much what like a FedEx would be today. So you had all these industries that were built upon rail, and as freight rail and passenger rail declined, it certainly had a negative impact on La Villa. Then I would say there, in addition to urban renewal, even though this area is very historically significant, not just in terms of Jacksonville history, but in terms of national history, it's unprotected. So from a preservation standpoint, we only have a couple of National Register historic districts in this city. And we have, I believe, 3 local historic districts within the city, and La Villa isn't on that list of any one of them. So despite its history, because it's not a protected neighborhood, it means the community has never had an opportunity to voice itself when it comes to demolitions. So many significant buildings that, as time is going on, that we don't know their past and their significance, those buildings just come down randomly, and that's lost history that takes place. And if you take that over the course of 100 years, you get to the point to where we're at today. I'd also say there are some, in the 1990s, there was a redevelopment strategy for that area that also led to the wholesale eminent domain and elimination of much of the neighborhood's built environment. But I will say La Villa still does exist. I think one of the challenges in my urban planning world and in the historic preservation part of it is, I always hear people say La Villa is an empty slate. It's a blank slate. You can just start over. There's nothing there. That's not actually true. You don't need a building for that space to be culturally significant to a population. And in addition to that, there's a lot of La Villa that is still left. I think as we've constructed I-95 and some of these urban renewal type barriers, we kind of lose focus on what La Villa really was originally. Originally, what we refer to now as everything on the west side of I-95, that was a portion of La Villa back during the 1880s, the early 20th century. But as 95 was constructed, we kind of considered the area that's within the Downtown Investment Authority's boundaries as La Villa. But really what we consider Newtown today is a portion of that original La Villa plantation that really predates the establishment of Jacksonville. I know we've talked a lot about Rosenwald, for example. So the West Jacksonville Elementary School is a Rosenwald school here in town, which is in Robinson's addition. And if you look at the history of that neighborhood, it in and of itself is a suburb of 19th century La Villa. So as La Villa developed, it grew northwest. And so Robinson's addition, areas that we now call Newtown, Durkeeville, Moncrief, all these areas, Northwest Jacksonville in general, is that extension of La Villa. So the community is still here, just because some areas, some buildings have been taken down. There's still a community that we need to engage with. So the last thing I would say in terms of where did it go or why did it go this certain area is the lack of inclusive community engagement. Over the years, we had a number of visionary plans for what this area and other areas of town should be, but very rarely are those plans set up to where the community plays a leading role in what the vision of an area should be. So that's one of the struggles why it's been so hard to rebuild the La Villa, is because that lack of community engagement and having a coordinated, transparent vision of what the area should be. I would also say as time goes on and you lose that historical knowledge while not connecting into the community in an adequate way, you lose the sense of history and cultural appreciation for what was there. So a shotgun house that might look as a blighted piece of property to an average person, that could have been a place where a Zora Neale Hurston grew up at, or where a James Weldon Johnson may have eaten soul food dinners, or Martin Luther King may have came to town to help organize or certain events, or other civil rights activists within our own community have played a role in. So how can we bring it all back? So the last thing I'll say about La Villa is we have to realize it still is here. Broad Street, Ashley Street, they're a great example of this. If you looked at Broad Street now, just north of the courthouse, say from Monroe Street up to State and Union Street, all those blocks, the buildings that are there, those buildings tie back into, that was like the Black downtown for Jacksonville. Every building you see along that stretch has played a significant role in not only the community, the La Villa's history, but Jacksonville's history. And many of those vacant storefronts, they have ties that tie back to several events, several significant individuals that we've talked about here today. I know Clara White Mission has been mentioned, Eartha White, and what she did there, and that being the Globe Theater, which is where kind of Ma Rainey got her start when the Rabbit's Foot Company was in town. Jelly Roll Morton, before he was known as Jelly Roll Morton, performed in that space. That space is also a place where intellectuals like Booker T. Washington, when they came to town, they would stay. A. Philip Randolph, and the same goes for like the Masonic Lodge there on Broad. So I would say if we want to bring it back, one of the things we have to do is we need to preserve and save what's left, number one. Number two, as infill development comes online, that infill development needs to be respectful of this historic sense of place of the community. And just because there's a vacant lot, we got tons of pictures, we got tons of people who grew up in this area, and people can pretty much tell you what that cultural landscape was, what that sense of place on the street felt like, what building heights and building scales and setbacks felt like. So if you wanted to save, enhance, and reconstruct or preserve a lot of what was there and cultivate that sense of place, it really does come down to needing some design guidelines and for a lot of the new development that's coming in, as well as protecting what's left. And then the last thing I would say is we have to find ways to honor and memorialize that past. I know Maury showed an example of the Johnson Brothers birth site, which is a vacant lot. Well, there are ways to pay homage and respect to those who have come before us. And there are several examples if we look across the country. So we're not recreating anything from scratch. We don't have to start from scratch. You can look to an Emancipation Park in the 3rd Ward in Houston. You can look to the redevelopment of the 22nd Street corridor in St. Pete, which is known as the Deuces. You can see what's taken place in Main Street in College Park, Georgia in the last 10 years. Or even Beale Street in Memphis. It may be a bit more touristy now, but I will say if you go back to the 1970s, Beale Street looked a lot like La Villa looks like today. And a lot of what they've done in the last 30, 40 years has been around telling their history from a musical heritage perspective.
So this is all great fodder for us to keep moving into a, now we actually have a lot of questions. So I'm wondering if perhaps the panelists might be able to start answering some of these questions. Aviva, quick question for you. Can the film get wider distribution?
Okay, let me just make a correction. I said it inadvertently wrong. Charles Hamilton Houston was the, Thurgood Marshall was his protege. So sorry about that, I said it wrong. Well, it's interesting that you say that. What happened is I'm now raising funds to pay off the rights because I only had rights to have a theatrical and non-theatrical. Once that's done, I'm going to start going to PBS and the streaming stations. I'm a little late to streaming, but if anything this pandemic has taught me, yes, I'm trying to. But I have to say, if you order the DVD, there's the film and 4.5 more bonus features, including things about how they restored a school. Something that I didn't address at all that I know Stephen knows a lot about is Leo Frank, who was a head of a factory, was running a factory, a Jewish man who was falsely accused of murdering one of the factory workers and was lynched. And it was actually his, his case that Rosenwald tried to raise money for. So yes, I hope I'll have good news in the new year. I'm trying very hard, but first you got to pay the rights. As you can see, the film is very rich in footage and archives and in newspaper headlines and etc.
Thank you, Aviva. This might be a question for either Stephen or Ennis, and maybe we don't have an answer to this. Do we know of any connections between Mr. Rosenwald and A. Philip Randolph?
Oh, it's interesting you should say
that. Aviva, okay.
No, I mean, I don't know if there's any connection, but I have to say one of the big things for me in making the film was the stories of the sleeping car porters and how they risked their lives literally to bring those newspapers from the north to south. So I assure you, if there had been a connection, I would have tried to, but obviously the message they sent had a lot to do with invoking the Great Migration, and him building the Michigan Garden Apartments was in response to the housing crisis of it. So it might be a little not as connected, but I don't know. Stephen, do you know anything?
I don't know with any certainty. My guess is that there would be a very minimal connection. A. Philip Randolph was both a socialist and a labor leader. And Julius Rosenwald, to put it mildly, was a capitalist. So I don't think there's likely to be any connection. Randolph was even not particularly sympathetic to the NAACP and James Weldon Johnson. My guess, and it's strictly a guess, it's a wonderful question, is probably a very, very limited connection.
And if you're ever in Union Station in Washington, D.C., there's a great statue of him.
Yes, there is. You're right.
Hopefully you'll be able to come someday soon.
Someday. Now, a question from Art Taylor. Booker T. Washington was considered a pragmatic leader who focused on technical skills. He's sometimes contrasted with W.B. Du Bois, who is attributed with a focus on intellectual education of the talented 10th. I can see how Rosenwald, who made the most of his limited education, would be attracted to Booker T. Washington's pragmatism. But ironically, it seems that from the pragmatism, we get many who would be considered members of the talented 10th. In other words, you can't tell who's going to be that talented 10th.
What I think is interesting is both received grants, and he had relationships with both. And actually, one of the most eloquent obituaries or tributes to Julius Rosenwald came from Du Bois, and Du Bois got 2 grants. So, and I think in Rosenwald's mind, both were doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was kind of hard to see then, and of course they had their conflicts, but you know, that was certainly true.
Very interesting.
And another great leader at that time was Madam Walker, who I recommend reading Alila Bundle's book on her great-grandmother. And, you know, and just the fact that she gave one of the grants for the Y in Indianapolis, which was a very large amount for that time. And she got sort of mixed treatment from someone like even Booker T. Washington. So we're all, you know, like there are today, there was all kinds of conflicts and issues going on that, you know, seems very different if you look at it from this point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah. The mystery is, of course, to what extent Rosenwald was even aware of the conflict. And it's really sort of puzzling that it's very difficult, actually, according to Du Bois, and even actually to Booker T. Washington, to see how those differing approaches could be reconciled. And yet, from what I can tell of Rosenwald's career and views, he didn't seem to be particularly aware that there was indeed a genuine divergence here, and it's one of the puzzlements of his career.
But I bet Emory knew, the man who ran the Rosenwald Fund, he certainly knew, and
Probably.
they all got grants.
Yeah. So this is a question for either Adonnica or Ennis. So when we say La Villa was diverse, was it nonetheless internally segregated? Like there was a Chinese neighborhood and a Jewish neighborhood, and or, you know?
Yeah, I would say it wasn't totally internally segregated. When you say internally or segregated, and when we think about that, I mean, there were places that if you were Black, you just couldn't live. I mean, within the law, you couldn't live there, or there were deeds that would not allow you to stay there. In general, La Villa wasn't that way. So while you did have pockets of higher concentration of different groups as they would come in, for example, if you know, a Chinese individual who has a storefront, the majority of people would stay above that storefront. So my employees would be people who would come from where I came from. They stay with me. So that's how you got these concentrations. But yeah, you could have somebody who is Syrian next door. You could have somebody who is African American next door. So it wasn't segregated like we think of traditional Southern segregation. I'll put it that way.
Great. Thank you. That's a great response. Now, this is a question to Adonnica from your cousin, Steve, Linda Wilkinson. Adonnica, you mentioned there were Black members of the City Council in the early 20th century. Actually, the first Black member of the City Council was Earl Johnson, who was elected with the advent of consolidation in 1968. He was followed by Sally Mathis. Or did you have someone else in mind? Were you thinking about the Adonnica, you're muted. There you go.
No, there were city council, Black city council members during Reconstruction era in the early 1900s. In fact, one of the things that when La Villa was annexed into Jacksonville, African Americans in La Villa and Jacksonville started really losing their political power. So there was actually, it was part of the step to disenfranchise African Americans in the political scene. And so I believe in 1907, Ennis, you can correct me, I think it was Mr. Spearing was the last city council person on Jacksonville City Council. I believe it was Mr. Spearing. And it was not until 1967 when Mr. McIntosh was appointed as city official, and Sally Mathis and Mary Singleton were the first women ever elected in 1967 to the city council. So there have been African Americans serving on Jacksonville City Council and La Villa City Council once Reconstruction era began. So no, there were African Americans active in politics during that time period.
Awesome. Thank you, Adonnica.
You're welcome.
Eve Apteker, are there tours of La Villa highlighting some of the places Ennis mentioned? Ennis, I think that may be a question. Adonnica, you too?
That's a question for me, but Ennis has been there, but yes, we do. I always make point, and I have trained my docents to make point to mention certain pieces, areas of the community, and point out the diversity, there's different ethnic groups. So we do point that out.
Do you do actual tours of the neighborhood?
Yes, I do.
Awesome.
Well, we haven't done in a while, but I have done the tours, the good walking tours. So have your good walking shoes on, and a bottle of water. But yes, we do make mention of it. We even in the original Ritz building, where the museum is now, in the original structure, there was a gentleman, everyone said there was this Arabian who had a store, and he would check their grades just like their parents would check their grades. And if they had good grades, he would give them $1. So just in that same building that the site where we are, there was an Arabian that had a business in the original Ritz building. So again, the diversity we were talking about earlier.
All right. There are a couple more questions, but we will try to answer them separately online. I'm going to give each of you a minute to say anything you might want to say, starting with Aviva.
You know, I always say not everyone has $68 million. If so, another new film I'd love to talk to you about. On Native American mascotting. No, but seriously, but I think we all have a JR, as he's called, a Julius Rosenwald inside ourselves. And certainly during this difficult times, it's all a matter of scale. And also, Ennis, if I have a master's in urban planning, if back then when I was getting a master's, instead of drawing dots, I may never have gone on to law school or filmmaking. So it's really wonderful that you're doing it. And I hope, Adonnica, to visit the museum one day and
sure
the DuPont thing. And, all of you stay safe, wear masks.
Thank you.
Ma'am.
Stephen, you are muted. If you have one comment to make.
Yeah, I'll pass the baton to Ennis, because I can't agree more that our tasks as citizens, our tasks as scholars, whatever, really is to ensure that the past is understood, the past is appreciated for a more democratic future.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Adonnica.
Yeah, this is really great to see what happens when we come work together, when we see someone with resources willing to help those that did not, but understanding that the education is a foundation to get people moving. So and what I do here at the museum is kind of that, in educating people on the history and encouraging people to learn about other cultures and become partners in what we can do to make our society better for everyone.
Thank you, Adonnica. Ennis, you're muted. One last word.
I would just say thanks for putting this together. Thanks for everybody for attending, and especially the panel. I think the more we can tell and share our diverse history and story is the best way to preserve and build an inclusive economic foundation for our community going forward. So let's continue with this.
And in the spirit of Matt's question, we want to do more of these histories and webinars, especially while you all are locked up in the pandemic. Please join our distribution list. We will be pushing out notices of new webinars coming up. Ping us on social media if that's the only way you can figure out how to reach us. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.